everybody. Welcome back to Antiwar Radio, Chaos 92.7 FM in Austin, Texas. Our next guest is Robert Parry from ConsortiumNews.com. He's the author of Secrecy and Privilege and Neck Deep, and one of America's great investigative reporters. Welcome to the show, Robert.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you back here on the show. Many people may not be too familiar with your history. You were one of the sharpest reporters on the story of the Iran-Contra scandal and the secret government basically operating somewhat under the auspices of the Reagan administration back in the 1980s. And I think you've told me before on this show that the funny thing about Iran-Contra is when you start peeling the layers of the onion, boy, is it sure hard to find the origin of this thing. It just seems to keep going back further. And then now in our new century, it seems like we're living the Iran-Contra scandal again in the way this government, well, in the way the vice president's office has basically made so many end runs around the rest of the permanent government in order to get their policies through in that same sort of fashion. But now you've gone through and found in the archives somewhere the missing chapter of, is it the Walsh Report, the Iran-Contra Commission report, Bob?
No, this was a chapter that was supposed to be in the congressional Iran-Contra report, which came out in October of 1987. And what was interesting about this chapter was that it dealt with how the Reagan administration had instituted a domestic propaganda operation using people assigned from the Central Intelligence Agency, experts in propaganda and disinformation, who then oversaw ways of trying to manipulate public opinion, intimidate the Washington press corps, and also in various ways punish members of Congress who were getting in the way of President Reagan's desire to support the Nicaraguan Contras, who were fighting then against the leftist Sandinista government. It's a remarkable chapter because it actually makes these conclusions that under the Reagan administration, the CIA, in effect, was turned against the American people and was performing functions like it would do in an enemy state, where the CIA goes abroad and tries to spread black propaganda, disinformation, undermine political opponents, and so forth. Essentially, what happened under President Reagan was the same approach was taken, but domestically, and that is not what the CIA is, of course, supposed to do. In fact, there were always been rules against the CIA operating domestically. But the way this was structured was that they took one of their top propaganda experts, a guy named Walter Raymond Jr., from the CIA and moved him over to the National Security Council to essentially externalize him from the CIA, and then he oversaw this operation from there, similar to what they did when they had Oliver North out of the NSC staff running the Contra War and claiming that it wasn't really a CIA operation, it wasn't a Pentagon operation, it was something else, it was something actually being run out of the White House. So this idea of sort of playing games with the law and the technicalities was part of this, but the more significant point was that the American people were targeted by what they called a perception management campaign, which was designed to change how they saw the threat, or the enhanced threat, as the Reagan administration tried to make it, of the Nicaraguan government, and thus justify the kinds of attacks that were being supported by the United States against the Nicaraguans. And then the other important point is that much of this that was sort of suppressed at the time, this chapter was dropped from the final report as part of a compromise. Some of the Democrats on the Iran-Contra investigation, people like Congressman Lee Hamilton, who was the chairman of the House side, wanted to have some bipartisanship. He wanted to have some Republicans sign the majority report. And there were three moderate senators, Rudman, Tribble, and Cohen, who agreed to sign on to the majority report. Part of the price that they asked for was the deletion of this very sensitive section. And a few parts of it were stuck into the executive summary, but the real conclusions and the evidence behind it were essentially lost on the cutting room floor. And so this chapter sort of ended up just disappearing into the files. And as I was going through some historical records just a couple weeks ago, I stumbled upon it.
Now, back then in the 1980s when you were writing, I think, for the Associated Press, right?
Right. Well, in 87, I'd gone to Newsweek. I was with the AP up through early 87, and then I went to Newsweek.
Now, did you suspect then that the CIA was involved in the American media on this issue then?
Well, sure. I mean, we saw it a bit differently because we were among the targets of this operation because we were digging up information that did not fit with the propaganda themes. We were describing what was actually happening with the Contras, some of the unsavory aspects of their operations. Some of them engaged in terrorism. Some of them engaged in drug trafficking. They were just taking out in certain villages. They'd go in and kill a lot of people. So the Contras were quite an unsavory lot. There were some good people in the movement, but a lot of them were not. And that was not what the American people were supposed to know. So there was this effort to contain these damaging disclosures. One of them was the fact that many of the Contra units were engaged in drug trafficking. And we broke that story at AP in December of 1985. So we were kind of targeted by what we saw was what was called a public diplomacy team, which was based at the State Department. And it was under a guy named Otto Reich, who was a sort of a right-wing Cuban-American, very aggressive. And he was sending his teams of people around to bureaus in Washington to lobby editors and bureau chiefs to silence, remove, fire reporters who were not towing the line. And they were having remarkable success at this. So a number of reporters were finding their careers being damaged for basically telling the truth and doing their jobs. And so we were seeing it from that point of view, and we knew many of the players involved because you'd also talk to them. Even when they were trying to attack you, they'd be people you would check in with once in a while. Because they had information, and they would sometimes share information. A lot of it turned out to be propaganda, as we found out. But you would get to know these people. So we were aware of this. What we were not aware of at the time, which actually I found out in some of the documents that were released during the Iran-Contra investigation in 87, was that there was this other level to it, that it went back to the White House, back to the National Security Council, and back to this CIA officer who was expert in these areas and who was overseeing the entire operation.
Mm-hmm. Now,
and that's what we were not aware of. Also, we were not fully aware that William Casey, who was director of CIA, had a direct hand in these operations to try to change how Americans perceived events.
Right. In fact, you quote in your article, Iran-Contra's Lost Chapter at consortiumnews.com, you quote from the report where the guy is talking about a phone conversation, or maybe multiple phone conversations, with Casey, the director of Central Intelligence. And he's saying that he was trying to change the subject because apparently he was really worried that the director himself was getting this far involved in the process of lying the American people into supporting the Contras.
Right. Walter Raymond was a fairly sharp guy, and he did try to take some steps to insulate himself from what he knew to be a legal problem, because the agency is forbidden to be involved in this sort of thing. So after he went to the NSC, he does resign from the CIA, and he tries to sort of get Casey to be a little bit more low-key in his efforts to sort of manage this operation, because this is improper. So Raymond was playing kind of a middle role. The key point, though, whether Raymond was still in the agency or had externalized himself from the agency, the key point was they were using the techniques that the CIA had perfected in going after governments in places like Chile or Iran or Guatemala. And they were just using those same kinds of concepts against the American public. So whether you are officially working at the CIA or not, the more significant point is that the government's applying propaganda tricks to get the American people to fall into line. But anyway, Raymond was sensitive to that point, as you say, and he did have conversations with Casey, but he never was able to get Casey really to back off. Casey saw this as a very important element of what he wanted to do. Casey was not someone, as those of us who followed him knew, who cared a lot about the fine points of law. He was more interested in getting his way and doing what he thought was necessary.
Mm-hmm. And now, I'm sorry, because we've already sort of gotten a few minutes into this, but I'd like to give a little bit of background for the youngsters in the audience and people who aren't too familiar with the background of, the story, what was happening in Nicaragua at this time. There was the American puppet dictator Somoza was overthrown by the leftist Sandinistas, and then the Contras basically, if I understand correctly, were basically a private army of machete-wielding butchers who went after women and children and never really even had the slightest chance of becoming the government of Nicaragua. They were basically just terrorists, killing people for killing people's sake and making money.